Welcome everybody to the World Circular Economy Forum 2023 Accelerator session. My name is Brian Shaw and I'll be your host today. Some housekeeping first. Mahmoud and our technical team are there to address any issues that you have, so just call them out in the chat. We're going to be talking for 1 hour about how regenerative agriculture can help us achieve a truly circular economy. And there's a lot of people here. I think we have already 400 people subscribed. We really welcome your comments and questions in the chats, and we're going to record all of these and we're going to turn them into an FAQ or a blog post, which we'll share with you afterwards. The session will be recorded and uploaded onto YouTube afterwards if you want to watch it back. In terms of the order of business, we're going to have a talk from Eva Gladek, followed by a panel discussion, and finally a poll at the end so we can hear what you all have to say. So now I'd just like to introduce Eva. She's founder and CEO of Metabolic and is the lead author of our Global Food Systems Report. Eva is an expert on systems change, on big transitions, and somebody who's really able to see the connections between everything and how this global transition can work. Can start with letting you know who our panelists will be, who will join after Eva joins. We have Philip Birker and Martina Henry. Martina works for Kraft Heinz Company and has been leading the development of many regenerative strategies and implementation plans for some very well-known food and beverage companies. And Philip Birker is co-founder of Climate Farmers. Climate Farmers are a super amazing organization. We're supporting the transition for farmers all over Europe towards regenerative agriculture. They do this through a peer-to-peer learning community, so farmer to farmer, learning how they learn best, developing context-specific transition supports, and they have 115 farm coaches, and they also supply and generate transition finance through Certified Carbon Plus certificates for those farmers. So both Martina and Philip playing a really important role in this transition to the regenerative agriculture future that we're all looking for. And I hope Eva is going to join me soon.
Hi, everyone. I'm here. So thank you, Brian, for the lovely introduction. And I'm just going to get right to it because I know we have a schedule to keep to and it's a great panel discussion coming up. So I'm going to share my video, my screen. And I am just here to do a quick introduction about regenerative agriculture, how we see that at Metabolic, and how we see the connection between regenerative agriculture and the circular economy, which is, of course, the theme of the World Circular Economy Forum. Can someone confirm that you can see my screen, please? I hope so.
We can see your screen.
Great. Thanks, Brian. All right. So first off, I'm going to do a quick intro about Metabolic and who I am, lightning speed. Then I'm going to talk about the food system as a whole. So its impacts, why we care about the food system, how that relates to the bigger sustainability challenges that we're facing. Then I'm going to talk about a vision of the food system that we could approach if we're trying to stay within the planetary boundaries while addressing human needs. And then I'm going to talk about how regenerative agriculture specifically is a key to doing that, to achieving both circularity as well as regenerating nature. So very quickly, as Brian said, I am the founder and CEO of an organization called Metabolic. Metabolic is actually not one organization, it's an ecosystem, as we call it, of 5 core entities. And we are purely focused on driving large-scale systems change toward transitioning the global economy to a fundamentally sustainable state where people and nature thrive. And we do that through our advisory practice, through venture building, through research, through helping communities on the ground, and through building software and data tools. So I didn't always think I would end up in sustainability as a career. Actually, initially, I wanted to be a biologist. I was really passionate about research science. But while I was in university, I ran into these horrifying statistics about how we were progressing as humanity, how the economy, the human economy, had basically started to take over natural systems. And I also started to look into that personally and ran into this planetary boundaries framework, which many of you on the call are probably familiar with. So this graph here shows 9 key Earth systems that have to be kept in a safe zone. So the safe zone is that green space in the middle for the planet to be livable for people. And we have transgressed many of those boundaries, multiple of them. Now, the food system, and by the food system, we mean everything from involved in the production and delivery of food, from the extraction of the raw materials and minerals needed for food production through the agricultural activities, food processing, and then finally food delivery. So that entire scope of activity is the largest economic sector globally, and it's the single most important driver of both planetary boundary transgressions as well as humanitarian and livelihood risks that we're seeing. Now, the reason for that, and the reason that we call it a leverage point of sorts, is that, as you can see here, it's very dominant in driving key impacts. So these are just a few. 25 to 30% of all greenhouse gas emissions that are causing climate change come from the food system. If you look at the surface of the planet that can support plant life and is therefore habitable, 50% of it is currently being used to produce our food, either feed for animals or crops directly for us. And if we look at important sources of protein as well as important ecosystems, so global fisheries, we can see that the vast majority of fisheries are fully exploited or at capacity, which is a really big risk for the 15% of people around the world who rely on fish and aquaculture products as their primary source of protein. So in summary, the current food system depletes soils and biodiversity, has a really significant carbon footprint, is emitting various kinds of pollution. The way that we've designed it currently as a kind of command and control system works against nature rather than working with it. And that also magnifies a lot of these problems. It's not particularly resilient, and it's susceptible to climate shocks, which are increasing by the year. And it also currently unequally distributes nutrition, and it keeps millions in poverty. So out of most of the people, if you look at the people who are living in greatest poverty, the vast majority of them are actually working in the food system. So we need to change things fundamentally. Now, just to also connect this to the topic of the circular economy and how the current food system is quite linear, I wanted to show a couple of graphs from the work that we've done over the years. So this is from our global food systems analysis. It's a Sankey diagram. So the thickness of each line represents the total mass of material. And what this shows in one picture is all the land that we're using for food production, and how that is translated into both animal and plant-based products, as well as other uses here. So you can see the huge amount of land that's being used to produce animal products via also fodder and pasture, both fodder and pasture, as well as the significant amount of land that's being used for arable crop production that results in food and non-food uses. Now, where most of this food ends up, because most of us these days live in cities, and that amount, the percentage of people living in cities is continuing to increase and will likely hit 70% in the coming years. You can see this graph here that shows how organic material entering, in this case, the city of Rotterdam, ends up being processed or used. Now, so Rotterdam is actually doing quite well because it has a significant percentage of organic waste going toward useful application. So being used for nutrient extraction and being put back into the system. And that's great to see that that's possible, because in many cities, this is a very, very tiny fraction. But still, even in a city that's doing as well as Rotterdam, we have a very significant percentage going into incineration, where a lot of the nutrients that have been put into the food system are lost. And the other aspect, which is extremely nonlinear, is that we have all of these CO2 emissions associated with the food and organic materials that are going through the city. So ultimately, it's a one-way street. We have a very linear system where nutrients are extracted from agricultural lands, sometimes very far away, and they're migrated into centers of population, and then they're lost in the system. So we have a significant problem on our hands, and we could talk about this for a long time, but we're not going to, especially because probably most of you are familiar with this. But the way that we've designed our command and control food system that's resulted from a lot of the practices introduced in the Green Revolution is squeezing out a really significant amount of productive output from the land under cultivation, but at the expense of future productivity by causing desertification, erosion of lands, salinification, compaction, all sorts of problems. And while at the same time not satisfying the needs of people in that system, not providing dignified livelihoods for everyone involved, and not equally distributing value or nutrition. At the same time, we know because of growth in population and growth in wealth, the FAO estimates that we're going to still need to double food output. Now, if you do the basic math, and we know that we're using 50% of our current terrestrial habitable land for food production, and we need to double. Using the same methods and the same way of thinking, we would need to use all land for food production. Now, that's obviously not something that we can or want, that we want to do or that we can do. It would leave zero room for nature, which is a death sentence for us on its own. So how can we create a sustainable food future is the core question. Now, if you look at how we're currently using our land, we have around 3% of our land focused on cities, 38%, strictly speaking, of all terrestrial land, so this is kind of where the habitable versus uninhabitable gets in, is used for agriculture. Only 23% is wilderness, and many researchers say that we need this number to be at least 50% to support ecosystem services. And 36% is modified land that you can roughly categorize as urban and industrial sprawl to greater or lesser extent. Now, we need to move to a different future land distribution vision, where we can imagine cities, which are these current resource and nutrient sinks, where all the material is coming in a linear fashion into these cities. We need to create more intensive urban and peri-urban agricultural zones combined with circular industrial zones, so where we're able to capture and meaningfully reuse all of these different resource flows. We actually want to make sure that between these dense urbanizations, we have very productive, regenerative mosaics of agriculture combined with recreation, combined with energy production, but areas that really create beautiful landscapes that work with nature rather than against it, and where we produce all of our extensive crops that cannot be concentrated, for example, in productive greenhouses. And then by over time, progressively shrinking our footprint, we can move toward a lot more wilderness by changing zoning, changing the way where we decide to put new production, et cetera. And so we can move to this kind of future land distribution. And a key part of this is healing the damage that we have already done through decades of industrial agricultural practice. And a key element of that is regeneration and restoration. So I love this image. It's from John D. Liu's work. He created a documentary about a particular area in China where you can see what it looked like. And after just a couple of decades, through efforts, actually top-down control efforts in China to reforest and improve this landscape, you can see that it's basically been returned from desertification. So that's an example of regeneration, of healing, of recovery. And regenerative agriculture is a term that we hear and use a lot. And it's a broad set of practices that should be tailored to particular conditions that essentially are aiming at this outcome, at healing the world, at recovering landscapes. And so these are some of the key outcomes that we associate with regenerative agriculture. So producing diverse and nutritious food, boosting biodiversity and soil health, making sure that nutrient and water cycles are closed at the right scales. So also considering how right now, because of global movements of food, we're exporting nutrients and we're over-fertilizing certain types of land that's causing eutrophication. We need to make sure that we're balancing that and that we're closing those cycles appropriately. Working with nature by engaging in strengthening ecosystems. So really actually creating natural landscapes integrated in a kind of mosaic with productive landscapes, promoting resilient agro-ecosystems, and then very importantly on the human side, improving livelihoods, creating dignified livelihoods that are diverse based on multiple product sources, and building on agroecology and the knowledge of Indigenous peoples and local communities, where a lot of this knowledge already resides and we just need to elevate it. So it's important for us to think about regeneration on multiple scales, because on a global level, we're concerned with these planetary boundaries. We're concerned about the movement of nutrients between continents, and we're concerned about natural intact vegetation of specific kinds of landscapes. So you can see here different kinds of landscapes around the world, such as temperate grasslands, savannas, and shrublands, and you can see where how much of each of these landscapes remains intact. And we're trying to also manage that on a large global scale. And then on the landscape scale, we're really concerned about land use patterns in a region and how those fit together also with sensitive areas that are biodiverse and where we choose to intensify versus remove agricultural activity. So this is kind of the landscape level balance that we need to look at. And then on the farm scale, this is really where we engage with farmers and try to understand what they can do locally to make sure that their soil isn't exposed, that they're not tilling and therefore destroying the structure of soils, that they're intercropping, that they're creating multiple valuable products, using agroforestry practices and using animals as natural cyclers of resources integrated with crop production. So I have just a few quick examples of how this can play out through projects that we've done, as well as things that we admire. So one of them is Alpro. So we've been working with Alpro, which is a producer of plant-based dairy alternatives. You've probably seen them in your supermarkets. So we initially did a kind of high-level analysis of how Alpro could keep its value chains for soy and almonds within planetary boundaries. So looking at the science-based targets for nature framework and how they could implement it. And they've been pioneering this for many years. After doing that analysis, though, we really realized that they had to start engaging with their farmers on a local scale. So we specifically looked at almond farming in Southern Europe and developed a whole guidebook for how their farmers in their farmer cooperative could apply certain practices, and worked with their cooperative. So this is these sets of practices and really were tailored to the local context. We're very much focused on reducing inputs and increasing soil cover, but also managing different types of landscape elements, better managing water. And for the farmers, this also these different practices through co-products also allowed for the production of additional income streams. Now, on the landscape level, this is an example that I know Brian likes. And can talk to more. So in Lyon, France, there was a problem with the quality of water coming into the rivers and into the local water supply. And the public institution actually defined an ecological threshold for farms around the city, because that's where the runoff was coming from, which was really problematic. And they encouraged farmers to produce food with minimal synthetic inputs, with not using as much fertilizer, which resulted in better quality water. But they also supported the farmers in creating a market for their produce. So they set up farmers markets to make sure that there were sales of these products. And this is often the problem with transitioning to regenerative farming, that there isn't a market that valorizes the products that are produced in this way. And then through public procurement agreements, the hospitals, schools, and prisons in Lyon were actually set up with contracts to buy those farms, food from those farms. So what this does is, you can see that it's a multi-stakeholder process that really, it's not just about what's happening on the farm, it's about integrating it into practices in communities that are adjacent to those farms. Now, lastly, this is an example that I really like. Sechem, also known as the miracle in the desert. In the 1970s, a man named Dr. Aboulesh decided to create a regenerative farm, and this is before the term regenerative was hip. He converted over time 2,100 hectares from desert, basically, into an organic biodynamic production system, which is hugely successful. So they've planted around 600,000 trees, sequestered a really significant amount of CO2, and are exceeding industry productivity in every business unit, and are also doing very well on the market. Now, I was in Egypt last fall for the climate conference, and Sechem had organized a number of events where they also signed commitments to extend their practice to prevent desertification and train thousands more farmers in this way of working. So it really shows that large-scale regeneration, and even preventing desertification is possible if these approaches are taken. Now, my closing thoughts before I hand back over to Brian is that, of course, when we talk about regenerative agriculture, we're often focusing on the farm level and looking at what has to happen specifically at the farm scale. And that's absolutely very important. But it's important for us to also consider what regeneration means at multiple scales, especially when we're talking about the fundamentally linear nature of the current food system, where we're extracting valuable resources, nutrients, and also land to some extent, and using it in a very linear fashion. And we need to figure out how to close those loops on all of these different resources. And that also sometimes means thinking on a transcontinental scale. And also we need to think about how nutrient cycles, food cycles, water cycles integrate between where people live, increasingly in urban areas, and how that interacts with the agricultural landscapes around those. So with that, I am very happy to pass back to Brian, and I hope you have a wonderful discussion with your panelists. And I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you so much for this thorough and integrated approach to how we can think about regenerative agriculture and the circular economy.
Awesome. Have a great chat.
Thank you. And also for closing the loop in your story. Martina and Philip, I've already introduced you, so let's get straight into it. Really appreciate you both joining us here. Martina, given what we know about regenerative agriculture not being a universally agreed concept, how can we make sure that it reaches its full potential to deliver us towards this future that Eva so eloquently laid out for us?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's a really important question. Farmers are overburdened often, as we know. They are tasked with being not just producing produce, but being environmentalists, being engineers, being data crunchers. They have so many jobs to do. And I think if we layer on more confusion in this space, we run the risk of losing out on what is the biggest potential we have to fix the problems that we have. So I think harmonizing our dialogue around regenerative agriculture and really disseminating what that means for a grower. And we all understand that it's very context specific and very local. It doesn't mean that we can't have a global framework that helps us create the narrative that brings people along with us. And certainly in a corporate world, that's really important, because if we start saying, well, it's this over here and it's this over there, that can lose people and lose the momentum. And honestly speaking, I guess, lose the investment that we need from corporates and from other avenues to be able to keep moving in this direction. I think, we also need to be cognizant of the duplicated effort that we can often sort of find ourselves sort of replicating. And so as a company, Kraft Heinz are part of a member of the Sustainable Agriculture Initiative platform. They're just one initiative that is essentially trying to drive harmonization around how we talk about this at a corporate level. So putting in place a framework that can then be context specific and localized and tested in those different geographies, the different cropping systems. So that's something that's very live and actionable at the moment. We're doing demos and we're trying to trial those different parameters on farm to understand. We're big in processing tomatoes, right? And what does processing tomatoes in California look like from a regenerative standpoint versus beans in Dakota versus corn in Brazil. So that's, I think, an effort that we can, as a corporate level, sort of take to really start trying to harmonize and minimize and allow the farmers to get on with doing what they need to do, and while still kind of getting what we need to do to be able to communicate back to consumers as well, because I think they're a big driver behind ultimately what we can do to, as Eva said, trying to make that link to the consumer in terms of the brands and the nutritional element that regenerative agriculture can hopefully deliver on. But I think we're at a window where we potentially lose this opportunity. We're at a very critical point, I think, in terms of driving adoption. And it's important that we try and do that in as streamlined a way as possible.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Philip, from the farmer's perspective, you work with a lot of farmers in Europe and helping them in the regenerative transition. What do you see as how we can make sure it really reaches its potential for them?
I think Martina already touched upon quite a few good points there. And I would agree, like the terminology is not the important part, right? The important part is that we agree that we need to start paying farmers for ecosystem services. So in the current agricultural system, farmers only get paid for yield, right? They don't get paid if they increase biodiversity. They don't get paid if they store water in the soil. They don't get paid for storing carbon in the soil. But farms are businesses. So they need to run economically profitable. So if we want to make the transition towards regenerative agriculture, we need to make an economical case for farmers to make that transition. And this is the driving force that we see. So what we need to agree upon for that is, what are the metrics that we're using? And what are the indicators that we use for those metrics? So how can we have indicators which make sense for farmers, which are easily measurable for farmers, and not a lot of paperwork which no one anymore needs, let's say, what they're unfortunately doing in the UK right now. But how can we make it easy for farmers to get paid for ecosystem services which they're providing? Because they are stewards of the land. They know what to do. They just need to have the incentive structure in place that rewards them for building up soil health and doing the right thing.
And then, so if we have the framework, as Martina described it, is a level playing field for the private sector, and then the farmers have a easily measurable set of metrics which then rewards them for the outcomes that they're delivering through the agriculture. What is then the key role for the private sector, for the corporates, for the Kraft Heinz's of the world, Philip, in driving that transition as you see it?
I think right now they are driving that transition, right? So the very interesting situation that we're having is, I believe government should be paying for this, right? Like these ecosystem services is something that we all have an interest in as society. But unfortunately, neither the subsidy system as we have it, nor any other government support is supporting farmers in this right now. Quite the contrary. We currently have the nature conservation law being discussed in the European Commission, and a lot of agricultural governments like Germany and France are blocking it, even though this would be the basis to finally start paying farmers for biodiversity. On the other side, we have food corporates, which are realizing, I think, that the way how they have been running their businesses over the last 10, 20 years is not going to work in the future anymore. They are seeing that their farmers are, and I'm sure Martina can add a lot more to that, but they are seeing that their farmers are not having the same yields anymore, that their input costs are getting higher, that there's a lot of farmers quitting the profession right now, that there's a lot of depression among farmers, and that we need to drastically change something, because in the end, they need to buy food and they need to buy the produce to make their own profit, which fair enough. And that led to the fact that we have now a lot of commitments out there, which I'm still curious to see how they're going to play out, right? Like we have very ambitious targets. I think my favorite is at the moment Bell Group with 100% regenerative agriculture produce until 2030. That's a steep one to get there. Nestle is currently at 6%. I like that they're at least communicating about where they are at right now. They want to have 25% till 2025. And they want to have, I believe, 50% until 2030. Right now, from all that we know, there's not more than 10 to 20,000 farmers in the European Union practicing regenerative agriculture out of 10.5 million. So if we want the corporates to be able to reach their targets, we will have to have a lot of farmers transitioning towards regenerative agriculture in order to be able to supply them with the produce in order to be able to hit their targets. So now it was the assumption that the goal is to hit those targets and not to change them anymore. We can see a lot of money flying into this. Nestle put 1.4 billion euros into this. And if that money lands into the pockets of farmers and actually supports them in the transition, then I think we have an incredible opportunity and time to finally fix that relationship. Because also, let's face it, FMCG companies and farmers, they have not always had the best relationship in the past, right? There has been a few misunderstandings, let's say. And I think regenerative agriculture has an amazing opportunity to change that relationship, because the Regen Ag transition is a long-term transition. So what I would love to see is for corporates to say, hey, we support our farmers in their transition, especially with the costs financially in the beginning. And in exchange, farmers are starting to have a long-term relationship with us again, which in the end is better for everybody because everybody can plan. And we all like to have more long-term rather than short-term relationship, right? Like a long-term marriage is always better than a Tinder match. And I think Regen Ag gives us the opportunity to move in that direction again.
I can certainly follow up on that. I think, no doubt fragmented supply chains and commoditized supply has not contributed well to certainly from a long-term security of supply. And that's the biggest impetus for us as a company. We need to produce food to feed the world and we feed people. So you need that supply to be able to do that. And a lot of the practices that have been, become mainstream over the past decades have been detrimental. It's a big tanker to try and shift around. And to your point, Philip, it is a transition that generations of farmers, while they are stewards of the land and they understand what their fathers have done and what their grandfathers did, they don't necessarily have that direct connection back to really indigenous type thinking. And I think it's a lot of things that need to change, and we need to bring that ecosystem of support through partners and experts and providing that expertise. So it's not just financial, but it's actually providing a sort of environment that allows a grower to engage and understand and access knowledge to adopt different practices while still maintaining the production and the economics of the farm that allow him to also have a market access into food corporate. So it's a complex kind of environment. I think the thing that we need to avoid doing with growers is this becoming just yet another label, i.e. sustainable or organic. And if we look at the organic, and this isn't dissing the organic movement at all, but if you look at it, it's 4% of the market because it drives this premium at the shop front. And often that's only then the available to those that have are the wealthiest in society. And if we want regenerative to be mainstream, we need it to be accessible to the mainstream. And in doing that, we shouldn't make it another certification that means it's out of reach for the majority of growers. And, to your point, Philip, all the paperwork that means in getting there. So how do we make it accessible and providing the right kind of ecosystem in terms of both incentives, but also knowledge transfer and access to market? Those things, I think, together are really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, with the organic farming, the premium is because they take on the risk and the burden of a different type of system. And we definitely need to raise the floor with regenerative agriculture rather than the ceiling, and quite a lot too, if we need to do what we want to do with the food system as Eva laid out. And I suppose if we want to raise the floor with farming, with agriculture for farmers, this also implies an increased burden on them and a risk for them. And I think, Martina, from your perspective, how can we think about risk sharing and burden sharing for those farmers to make sure that we can incentivize them into this?
Yeah, there's certainly a risk and reward spectrum, I would say. And there are many types of growers. There are sure a lot of smallholders who need a lot more support. In Kraft Heinz, we have a lot of very large growers who are very big business operations in their own right. They have a greater risk appetite, and they have also greater means to be able to take on that transition. And for them, their approach is often, we want to invest in it because we see the opportunity of driving either a greater market access or driving a more nutritious product, or actually just encompassing, and we haven't talked about carbon today, but carbon as from a corporate perspective is also a big lever, right? I don't like taking a carbon lens, but if it opens up opportunity to drive these programs that we can then address the plethora of other aspects in terms of biodiversity and nature and water, then I'll take carbon every day. And I think for growers, they don't necessarily want to monetize this through a carbon credit. They just want to sell a carbon neutral product and have that recognized as being not a premium in that sense, but just valued for all of the assets. And Philip, you mentioned the ecosystem services. We also want data from farmers, and we don't necessarily pay them for that either. And so how do we deconstruct all of that and understand the true value? And for me, then it's a case of how do we expand the pie and improve the value for everybody, as opposed to just fighting over who gets what portion of the existing pie. And I think that's where regenerative has that opportunity to improve nutrition density of food, to improve the ecosystem that then improves hopefully the yields and the resilience. For me, it's not necessarily about, we hear lots of things around yield drop with regenerative, certainly in the first couple of years, and there's never necessarily a guarantee of that longer term. But are we better off having a, let's say, 10% reduction in yield 1 year through 10 versus having 20% increase 1 year and then 4 years of it being 50% because we've got no water? That for me, that resiliency and that long-term consistency is actually more valuable to us as a Kraft Heinz. It's also more valuable for the grower because that risk, it's a very, we all know a very risky business being a grower. The nature will have its way, and you have to have that resiliency in order to really stay at it. And certainly, the aging farmer profile is a concern going forward if we look at how do we feed the planet in the future when we've got nobody who wants to stay on the land, and we have to be cognizant of all of those challenges for growers.
Absolutely. Philip, from your perspective, working with the farmers, is the increased resilience that they see in their agro ecosystems a sufficient incentive for them, or are there other sort of risk sharing elements that are important to take them along?
No, I mean, I think there is certainly the desire of farmers to change. And I think a lot of farmers, and specifically in Southern Europe, a lot of farmers are realizing that the way how they have been practicing in the past is not the way forward, right? Like there's a lot of issues of crop loss, of droughts, and floodings at the same time, right? That's the interesting thing. We have the issue with both, actually. But the problem is they cannot do this transition alone, right? Farmers have assets, they don't have cash flow. So we can, for example, with Climate Farmers, we can help with providing our peer-to-peer learning community. We can organize farm visits. And it's incredible to see farmers which visit other regenerative farmers, right? Their eyes light up. Like when they see that someone has green grass in Portugal in June, they are amazed by this. But they need more support to make this happen. And I think that's where especially this long-term plan comes in. Because if you just don't have the cash, then it's very hard to make it happen, even if you see the long-term gains in it. And for example, on the consulting side, there are just not that many good regenerative agriculture consultants. We work with around 115 across Europe. And from what we hear from our farming community, that's almost all of them. And that also means that they're in very high demand, which means obviously they ask for a daily rate, which is not going to be for free. And that needs to be paid. So there needs to be a transition plan. Then if you want to plant an agroforestry system, okay, that's trees you can get paid for free. But as soon as we look into new machinery or fencing, there's money that needs to be invested, and farmers don't have this. I see insurance companies playing a role here as well, because insurance companies already are realizing that for them, it's not a good case anymore to insure farmers against crop loss because of the higher risks. In the Netherlands, we are trying out some projects right now with Nationale Nederlanden to analyze this. So they could be, for example, providing something like transition finance through transition insurance. And I see banks playing a role as well, which want to make sure that their farmers are staying their clients, which could potentially give loans, and FMCG companies which have an interest in having the produce with higher nutrient density and the ecosystem services. And if all of these step together in to carry the burden together with the farmers, then I'm sure we would see a large amount of farmers transitioning, because the desire is there, the interest is there, but it's just a support network that's currently still missing, unfortunately.
So it sounds like we need a lot of partnership and everybody pulling in the same direction.
Yes. What's
stopping us from getting there right now? What do we see as like some of the key challenges?
Am I stepping in there?
Either one.
I think Philip's mentioned it there in terms of finding the right partners for the right agri-system that you're working in. We're in that process now of gathering partners and building our ecosystem internally for implementation in the field, certainly. I think you're absolutely right, Philip, in terms of the broader ecosystem. You know, we have a large footprint in the US, and there's been a lot of government funding coming out lately in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act, as an example. And we're actively looking at how do we provide access to our growers and sometimes our intermediate supplier through those programs, so that we can offset and cost share across all of that model that can help us scale and really drive opportunity for growers. But there's other ecosystem players, I think, in there as well, and certainly in other geographies, governments are not yet as set up for that, and I think there's a large role for the EU certainly to help kind of get on board there. I think, you know, largely speaking, the engagement of growers is whilst they may be willing, there's that risk and there's the unknown of the transition. So that's always a challenge. And as I said, you've got different types of growers. Some are more kind of engaged and willing to, you know, they're already doing this. Some of them have been doing it for 30 years without anybody motivating them and incentivizing them. So, you know, looking at individuals as where they are and meeting them where they are in terms of their mindset, I think is really critical to how we engage them. And then from a corporate perspective, internally, you know, we have to explain what does regen mean, and because of the lack of a kind of codified definition, I think that becomes a challenge. So bringing senior leadership along and trying to explain and disseminate some of these quite technical concepts in a very simple format is challenging. But certainly I think Philip's correct in the sense of seeing with your eyes is what's the most powerful. And I think getting leaders into the field and really listening and speaking with farmers is one of the most powerful things we see in terms of making that systems change. And yeah, the carbon piece, I guess I mentioned before, is the lever that I think we not in terms of carbon credits, but certainly in terms of understanding how does this support our net zero ambitions as a company. We hold on to it and then just make sure it's just one facet of what we need to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I was looking at the Nestle video yesterday on their regenerative agriculture ambitions that Philip mentioned, and the video ends with their net zero by 2050. So they're being very explicit about the link between the two.
Yeah.
So talking about bringing people into the field and the inspiration and these sorts of things, I'd love to hear, we're talking about the challenges and the barriers, but there's, what are the points of inspiration that we can take from both of your experiences? Martina, what sort of challenges have you overcome, and how can you inspire the audience with a nice story for all of us?
I'd like to say I've overcome challenges. I think it's an ongoing journey. I don't know that I would have any kind of North Star that I would say, oh, here's the magic bullet at all. I think it's just a constant commitment to really pursuing this and to engaging growers and honestly building trust. What's the biggest thing that we've had this disconnect with the grower, as Philip said, for a long time, and really understanding that they are people that have families, that have ambitions. And we have a tendency, I suppose, particularly as the developed world, to sort of patronize them. Why aren't there more people in farming? Well, have you been a farmer? Do you know the hours that it takes? Do you know the risk and the worry and the concern? And putting yourself in their shoes and really understanding what it takes to be a farmer, and then understanding that they have aspirations that need to be satisfied in the same way that ours do. So we sit in our cities and we eat and drink the results of their hard labor without necessarily really understanding what it took to put that into a bottle or onto a plate. So for me, it's constantly about really putting the farmer first and understanding that without the farmer being economically viable, if a farmer can't send his kids to school and put food on the table, why is he going to care about the environment or about the workers that he might be employing? So we really need to put that at the center, and that's certainly something that we're very mindful of and trying to pursue. But yeah, no magic wand and no magic bullet, but I think a constant pursuit of that ambition.
I suppose if there was a magic wand, we'd already be there, but slow and steady wins the race, right?
Sure, yeah, a bit of tenacity and resilience, I think, yeah.
Philip, what about you? You're in the field. I know that you travel a lot, both doing all of these speaking events, but also really speaking to farmers and hearing their voices. What have you seen out there that gives you hope and inspiration?
I mean, I think the entire movement, like I got into this back in 2017, right? And I did my big tour, kind of visiting 60 farms in 2019. And back then, nobody was speaking about regenerative agriculture, right? Like all of these farmers were pretty lonely. I found 60 farmers across all over Western Europe back then practicing regenerative agriculture. That has certainly changed. And I think one very interesting thing, there's also this whole thing about, and I think Martina said it good, was like putting the farmer back at the center of the food system. But also that means for all of us and for every single person to start paying appreciation back to farmers. Because one of the biggest issues that I'm seeing is literally this fact that we have an aging population in Europe in terms of farmers especially. I grew up in an agricultural context. My godmother had a farm. Her farm is ending in her generation. In my high school, in a 5,000 people village, nobody wanted to become a farmer, right? It was rather, if you do bad in school, you have to become a farmer. That's messed up. Like farmers are the backbone of our society. And if we don't manage to make it attractive again, then we will not be able to get young people back into farming. And the biggest demographic that we are seeing in farmers transitioning towards regenerative agriculture is age. Because obviously that transition takes at least 5 to 10 years, if not more. So if you're 58 years old, 5 years before your retirement, you're going to think twice about changing your entire operations and putting in that energy again. But in that direction, we are already seeing a lot of movement. I think Kiss the Ground did an incredible job there in terms of storytelling and in terms of kind of explaining why regenerative farmers are kind of the heroes of our times. We're also trying to do our fair share there. I think Nature did a good job there as well. And I find it amazing already when I started the company with Evo, like we were really we're wondering if we will find anybody that's going to be willing to work with us on this, right? Who's going to be willing to work in agriculture? It's not really a sexy department, but now we get incredible amounts of applications for people to join us on our team. We get a lot of people that have an interest in working with farmers and going to farmers. So I think we're starting to find a movement, also partially fueled by the pandemic, I think positively, to go back to the land for people to be starting to be interested in that again. And that's what we need to build up on. So here I would have loved, again, governments or individuals stepping in to provide access to land also for young people. Of course, we need more younger farmers, but it's very hard to lease land and to buy land. So that's something that we need to do because we have a momentum, I think, of the drive towards regenerative agriculture and towards young people wanting to go into agriculture, and we need to fuel that more. And with that, we can hopefully come to a world where the farmer is back at the center of our society and of our food systems, and where it also gets more attractive again to live on the rural side, right? So a lot of this has also to do with rural development, bringing cultural life back to the countryside, and essentially giving back to a society where we're more connected with the food that we're eating and the stewards of the land that are providing our food.
And I think maybe if I can just add in, because I think we talk very much about regenerative, but if we take a step back and look at this circular economy piece, regenerating the land is only one part of this food system transformation that needs to take place. And we absolutely need to reduce our kind of footprint on the land in the first instance, in the sense of producing more from what we're getting and not wasting. We have a huge amount of food loss and waste across the value chain, and particularly at post-consumer level. And consumers don't really have that connection to what it takes in terms of all the inputs that go into producing your food. So of course it's taken with less value than when they can just throw it away, because you know, if it's cheap in the supermarket and you don't, you know, you can buy a bag of carrots for, I don't know, is it 12 cents when they're during peak? It's ridiculous when you think about what the work that goes into that, the amount of carbon that goes to produce, you know, the water, all of the inputs. And so I think making that connection and making consumers really understand, and the brands I think have a huge amount of opportunity in making that connection for the consumers. We mentioned before about the nutrition density piece as well, but really unlocking that sort of imagination in consumers is really, I think, a critical piece going forward.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think there's a lot that we can do to also reconnect people through food to nature and to landscapes and sort of re-educate a little bit on the importance of the rural parts of our landscapes. Do we think that cheap food is too cheap? Do we think that increasing the costs of food and delivering more value through consumers to farmers is one of the important levers?
I think we're putting the wrong focus on food, right? So I think one thing that we haven't touched upon so much yet is nutrient density. I think a massive issue that we're having is that we are currently measuring food in amount and in calories. That's not what our body cares about. Our body cares about getting nutrient-dense food. And due to the way how we have been farming in the past, the nutrients of our food nowadays are a fraction of what they used to be 50, 60 years ago. And I'm very excited about some of the nutrient density studies that we're involved in, which are coming out in 2 to 3 years, where already we have the first indications showing now that produce from regenerative agriculture is 20 to 30% more nutrient dense than organic. And that means that I think we will have a very good chance of saying, hey, I pay maybe even a little bit more for the current, but I actually get more nutrients for my buck. And on top of that, we come again back to the ecosystem services, right? Once we start paying farmers fairly for storing water, increasing biodiversity, and increasing carbon, regenerative food would be cheaper than conventionally produced food. You were touching up on the magic wand, Brian. If I would have a magic wand, I would love to establish true cost accounting in the world right now. If we would have true cost accounting established, regenerative produce would be the cheapest produce out there because it has a positive effect on society. And in that way, any feedlot that we would be having, you would have to pay a lot more for the feedlot meat that you're buying than for the holistically grazed meat of the cows behind me, because those cows are regenerating our planet and they're not having a negative effect on us. And the cows in the feedlot, well, they're having a bad life and they're having a bad effect on our planet. And that's where we need essentially, again, government, unfortunately, to step in and to say, hey, we need to start taxing, and we now start taxing based on the real costs that are incurred by the food that is produced right now.
I couldn't agree more. I think we have externalized those externalities, and for sure, I think incorporating those into the food system allows people to make a more equitable kind of choice at the shelf, and that needs to be driven by a regulatory system that supports that for sure.
Yeah,
I think if I think back to Eva's talk about the limitations we have in terms of the amount of land that we can use for producing food and the other materials that we need versus conservation and more space for nature, I think there's a fundamental question of what are we actually producing on the land that we have in terms of empty calories or foods that are not nutrient dense or foods that are unhealthy for that matter.
For me, farms are nature. I don't think in that diversion. I think this is exactly the issue that we're having also in our mindset, right? We always think of, oh, this is nature and this is humans. We are nature. All of this is nature. And essentially farms can be thriving ecosystems which are interacting with the ecosystem around them. There's not a clear-cut line between the farm and the forest next to it. And I think that's the mindset shift exactly that we need to have, that all of it is essentially our planet that we need to take care of as part of our farming operations. We can totally grow food on this planet in line that supports the nature and the ecosystem around us because we are part of it.
I think that's a great and eloquent way to end this panel discussion. So I have a poll now, and for all of our participants here, I'd really love to hear your perspective in this. Also Martina, Philip, and Eva, feel free to input your ideas here. Let's see how we can steer our audience. What I'd like to ask, and you'll see a poll popping up on your screen, is where would you like to see more initiative, more action, more energy from to support the uptake of regenerative agriculture? Should it be through education and awareness, financial support, policy reform, or consumer demand? And so when we think about education and awareness, widespread education campaigns for consumers, for farmers, these sorts of things. Financial support, should we be providing more incentives to farmers and businesses who are scaling regenerative practices? Policy reform, should we be implementing stricter regulations to engage the private sector and corporates in how they can do their part for regenerative agriculture and also positive incentives, of course, or consumer demands? How can we empower consumers to drive the demand for regenerative agriculture, thereby encouraging retailers and businesses to adopt regenerative practices? We'd love to hear what you all have to say, so please submit your answers. I would personally say all of the above. I don't want to choose.
Yeah, for sure. I think they're vital. It's sort of like a recipe, right? And you need a little bit of each of these in the right dose to make the perfect cake. And I think, to deliver on what we need to do, I think the consumer demand piece, I think is probably the trickiest one, because how much is that push versus pull? I think there's an opportunity for us as branded companies to kind of bring the consumer along with us. And there's probably in truth really only a niche level of consumer who can drive that demand by themselves right now. But I think that's where the regulatory framework also helps nudge consumers as well along. And we've seen it with the plastic bag levies as an example of how quickly consumers can adopt different sort of initiatives once they're nudged in the right direction. And I think there's a huge opportunity there for us to work and to, look at how do we lobby governments to work for the food system and not necessarily for just a section of that food system, be it farmers or corporates. So I think, looking at how do we all win through this going forward and make sure that, like I say, we grow that pie and therefore we grow the value that everybody gets from that pie rather than scrabbling over what's there currently.
Definitely a nutrient dense pie at that.
Yes, exactly.
Philip, if you had to choose one, which would you go for?
I would also not want to choose one. I think that this is, you cannot look at this from a simplistic point of view, right? Like, it's a complex system. We need a systems change. And for that, all of that needs to be involved. And we need all of the actors pulling on the same string. I think what's interesting to mention here is, for example, the Big Food Redesign, which was just launched by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which is exactly putting this forward, right? All the different actors on the player. And very exciting there as well. Supermarkets are for the first time involved as well, because they are very much staying out of this whole regenerative agriculture debate until now. And we need them in there, right? Because consumers, all of us, are still buying on supermarkets. I very much concern myself with the food that I'm eating, and I'm trying to get as much as possible directly from farmers, but I still go to supermarkets. And I think the same goes for everybody. So unless we make it possible for everybody essentially to buy regenerative produce in their supermarket, produced by FMCG companies and by smaller startups and by anybody, and produced by farmers, which are actually getting paid for regenerating the land, then we have the whole system in place, right, where everybody can kind of essentially have the benefits of a regenerative agriculture transition. And I think the interesting thing here to mention as well is once we have the access to the food, I believe it will be a no-brainer that people will buy it, because one of the very beautiful things is nature is genius. More nutrient-dense food tastes better. And the people which are right now pushing Regen Ag forward is very often the Michelin star chefs, because they can taste the difference. So I don't think we even need massive marketing campaigns, because you give me one tomato that's regeneratively grown and one that's conventionally grown, and everybody will be able to tell you, I want to buy the regenerative tomato. So we just need to put the product in front of the consumers and they will make the right decision by themselves.
Sounds like a delicious prospect. Eva, anything to contribute?
I mean, it's been really interesting hearing you have this conversation. Definitely lots of points where I wanted to, where I could have jumped in, but I don't want to stir things up now at the end. And I agree with you, Brian and Philippe, that we need all four of these things. It's really impossible to pick between them. So, yeah.
Okay, well, thanks very much for all of you. I hope you can all see the results of the poll, but it's well, policy support and policy reform and financial support are up top, education and awareness next, and consumer demand last. But I think we can all agree that systems approach is the right approach to this, and let's all make sure we're doing what we can to pull this thing in the right direction. And I really appreciate all of you joining us for this discussion, and the participants and the World Circular Economy Forum for inviting us to run this session. I wish you all a healthy and happy and regenerative weekend ahead, and we'll be in touch. And thanks for all of your questions too.
Thanks so much, everybody.
It was a pleasure. Have a good weekend.
Yes,
Ciao.
thank you.